showcase. This is the Reverend Amy Snow. She is the pastor of Pleasant Ridge Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her work is around assessing prophetic leadership with respect to racial justice with non-Black teaching elders in the Presbytery of Cincinnati. Amy, excuse me, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Sure. I'm wondering, Chris is starting my slides. Great. Wonderful. Thank you. As Dr. Kauser introduced me, I am a DMin student at Louisville Seminary, and I'm in the pastoral care and counseling track, and I have hopes to graduate this December. In order to talk about my project, I need to share a little bit of history with you. Next slide, please. Can I do this? Okay, here we go. Cincinnati, Ohio is located on the borders of Indiana and Kentucky. And as you may know, at one point in the history of Kentucky, they had legalized human trafficking and forced labor camps. And while Indiana was admitted into the Union in 1816 as a free state, the 1820 census still showed more than 100 enslaved people there. So Cincinnati became the destination for people from these states who were fleeing bondage. Next slide, please. So the growing population of free Black people in Cincinnati became a magnet for violence. In 1829, immigrants looking for jobs raided the 4th Ward, where the majority of the free Blacks lived in Cincinnati. And this violence continued for over a week. Over half of the Black population of Cincinnati left at that point and started the community of Wilberforce, Ontario. In 1967, a young Black man was convicted of being a serial killer, the Cincinnati Strangler, and that was on very scanty evidence. In 2001, there was a shooting death of a 19-year-old unarmed Black man for a traffic infraction. And that sparked the largest urban unrest in the United States since the 1992 LA reaction to the acquittal of the officers in the Rodney King case. But what I need to say about this particular violence was that 6 years prior to Timothy Thomas's death, there were 15 young Black men who died in the custody of police officers. So Cincinnati has a sketchy history with regard to racial justice. Next slide, please. Thank you. But there did exist a seminary in Cincinnati, Lane Theological Seminary, that was run by a prominent abolitionist, Lyman Beecher, who cultivated passionate Presbyterian ministers to his cause. Next slide, please. We know that most abolitionists had no desire to welcome the formerly enslaved, choosing colonization instead. They wanted to send emancipated people back to Africa from which they were stolen. Lyman Beecher was one of these abolitionists. But there were a group of immediatists at the seminary, students who were in favor not only of immediate emancipation, but also welcoming these formerly enslaved as equals created in the image of God. Theodore Weld was one of the students that led this group. And in 1834, they led a series of debates between these two abolitionist positions. And James Hall, editor of the Western Monthly, wrote, "This is the first instance that we have ever known of a set of young gentlemen at school dreaming themselves into full-grown patriots and setting seriously to work to organize a widespread revolution to elevate a whole race of human beings in the scale of moral dignity." Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the debates perturbed the trustees of the seminary so much that they prohibited the talk of abolition at all, and Theodore Weld led 40 students to leave the seminary in protest. But one of the local pastors who was present was John Rankin, and he continued to house formerly enslaved people on the Underground Railroad. And one of the interesting things about him is that he built his house out of bricks because it was so frequently burnt that it was easier to rebuild. And he says that oppression maketh a wise man mad, whether he endures it himself or sees it inflicted on others. Next slide, please. So I said here that there were pockets of progressive Christianity. What I should have said was that Cincinnati had pockets of Christianity, because I don't believe that anyone holding enslaved people could be considered a Christian. But these individuals felt that their calling was to preach the gospel, which included equality of human people, all human people. And the thing that surprised me was that they were Presbyterian. Next slide, please. So coming to Cincinnati in 2008 and learning later about this history, I thought, why don't we talk about this? And what happened to this prophetic witness? Next slide, please. So my denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, has a Matthew 25 vision to build congregational vitality, dismantle systemic racism, and dismantle systemic poverty. At our national gathering this past summer, the 224th General Assembly, they recommended an action item that all entities, from our presbyteries, which are like dioceses, to our congregations, to our mid-level governing bodies, adopt anti-racist policies and suggest training for all members of each council. So what did our presbytery do? Next slide, please. We formed a committee. We formed an anti-racism policy work group, but at our very first meeting, we decided that writing policy and implementing it simply wasn't enough. So with the support and the blessing of the council and our general presbyter, who's like our bishop, we changed. And next slide, please. We renamed ourselves the Racial, Ethnic, Multicultural Justice Force. And this force's goal is to assist congregations with the Presbytery of Cincinnati to move along the continuum of becoming anti-racist multicultural congregations. And our vision is that the Presbytery of Cincinnati become a significant force in the Cincinnati region in the support of racial justice and dismantling structural racism. And our mission is to move the needle on racial equity within and across the Presbytery of Cincinnati, supporting and executing the Presbyterian USA Matthew 25 principles in dismantling structural racism. Next slide, please. So in service of these goals and this mission, I did a survey this past summer of the teaching elders, all our clergy in the Presbytery of Cincinnati. About half responded. And of the respondents, about 63% were either solo pastors or heads of staff. So they're able to set the preaching schedule. 80% were white, 58% male, and 65% over the age of 55. So old and white, and some white women who are older. Now, 80% said that the topic of race did come up with their church leadership, but the majority of respondents said that they were either very uncomfortable or extremely uncomfortable talking about race with their leadership. And some of the write-in responses were perception within the congregation that these are political issues that will cause great conflict within the congregation, or the subject is very touchy and I don't really have the language or knowledge to answer questions or dispute myths or gently address racist misconceptions. Next slide, please. So from that survey and in discussion with Dr. Kauser and leadership in my presbytery, I developed a project. I invited a sample of 15 non-Black teaching elders in our presbytery to participate in a questionnaire and an interview with the goal of assessing where these particular congregations are with regard to becoming anti-racist congregations and what their clergy leaders are doing to help them make this racial justice progress. So that's my project. It's a mixed methods project. But for our presbytery, I am trying to get an idea of where our presbytery is starting with regard to our racial justice mission and vision goals. Next slide, please. So my pre-interview survey is based on the Western States Center Dismantling Racism questionnaire that assesses organizational racism. So it's based on that particular tool. Next slide, please. I have some preliminary data. Each particular subheading has about 6 questions, but I've pulled a little data for you to see. So under the umbrella of who makes decisions in your church, the respondent said, has your church analyzed who makes decisions and who does not? Well, some people had analyzed, but the majority had not analyzed who makes decisions. And if you can see at the bottom, the majority of respondents either didn't know or did not believe that everyone knows how church decisions are made in their congregation. Next slide, please. Who has control and influence over financial resources? So the slide to the left says, are people of color included in discussions as budgets are being made and funds being allocated? So 50% said yes, people of color were included in discussions. But when asked, is racial equity a consideration as the budget constructed, the response was overwhelmingly no. Next slide, please. And when we talk about what kinds of education about racism and oppression is provided, I asked the question about preaching sermons with the topic of racial justice. You see that the majority of people say that they preach a sermon regarding racial justice 3 to 4 times a year. And what was interesting to me was that the next highest response rate was for people who say that it's a consistent part of their preaching. And over to the right, you can see that the majority, overwhelming majority, have hosted conversations on race and justice in the congregation. And just from this preliminary data, I would conclude that most pastors feel more comfortable talking about this topic, not in the pulpit, but outside of the pulpit. Next question, please. Or next slide. So when I asked about people of color on staff currently, on the left, 30% had people of color on staff. And when asked what positions they held, the positions were custodian, maintenance, nursery school director. But when I asked, has your church ever had people of color on staff, there were over 50% that said yes. The responses were custodial staff, maintenance staff, but there was also a senior pastor and 2 associate pastors listed. I also thought it was significant that there were over almost 40% that did not know their history. Next slide, please. Does your church seek input and guidance from people of color organizations or community leaders of color in strategic planning and decision making? That response was overwhelmingly no. Does your church advocate for the participation of people of color organizations when working in coalition with other groups? Now that response actually had almost 50% of the respondents or more say yes. So white churches are willing to advocate for people of color organizations, but we really don't want input for them on how we should run our own organization. That's what I'm taking from this data. Next slide, please. My next step is to interview pastors, and I will code these interviews according to the way of emancipatory praxis. So that's my next slide, please. So KARIN Case has developed this particular methodology. She says these practices help people become more anti-racist. And so these are breaking silence on issues of race and racism, recovering historical memory, confessing limits of understanding, opening ourselves to being changed, seeking accurate information about the mechanisms and harms of white supremacy. and listening respectfully and humbly to the voices of those who are harmed by white supremacy, receiving and integrating new information on both cognitive and emotional levels. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Analyzing and confessing our own participation in the systems of white supremacy, and taking concrete and practical action against white supremacy. Next slide, please. And this is the continuum on becoming an anti-racist multicultural church. So there are different places for the churches to land, from anywhere from an intentionally segregated church or a club church, all the way to a church that is actually working to change in a changing society. Next slide, please. So my hypotheses are, the more evidence of engaging in the practices outlined in the way of emancipatory praxis, the higher the score will be on the pre-interview survey, and the further along the BART continuum a congregation will be. And I also feel that most teaching elders or clergy will probably think that their congregations are further along the BART continuum than they truly are. And as far as receiving and integrating new information on both cognitive and emotional levels, I believe that clergy who are actively engaged in pastoral care with their congregations and skilled in pastoral care and integrating it in many different ways in their interactions with their members will help them to integrate this information on both cognitive and emotional levels. And I think that this is one of the best antidotes to white fragility. And I also believe that our presbytery will find pockets of both progressive and resistant theology regarding racial justice. Next slide, please. And I believe one of the questions that we need to look at more clearly is an examination of the way clergy are remunerated, because we need to think about how our pastors are freed to preach the gospel. So in other words, we need to uncouple the offering plate from the pulpit. So, and I would be happy to try to answer any questions that you may have for me.
Hi, this is Gerald Taylor. I'm curious about the last point that you made. A number of things about your work I find interesting. The last one about separating the pulpit from the plate. How do you see that being a practical, realistic way of being done? And how is that consistent with any understanding of the relationship of the pastor to the congregation?
So I think that's a great question. And basically, the reason I bring that up is that I find that the most white pastors that I have talked to, and pastors who do preach on racial justice, get an immense amount of pushback from the congregation. And people want to withhold pledges or to direct what the pastor will preach by controlling the finances. And there are numbers of cases of pastors who have been forced out of congregations, lost their jobs, because they chose to preach on racial justice or felt that that was an important thing to preach on. So that's why I think it's important. How we do that, that's a great question. And I don't know. That's why it's for further study. And how does that relate you to your congregation? Yeah, that's another great question. And at this point, I haven't done any research on that. That's my further study piece. So I have just as many questions as you do, but I think it's important to look at.
All right. Thank you.
Susan, this is Dr. Kauser. Are you arguing that pastors may not preach about racial issues or racial justice, but they might have somebody come in and do a talk or a Bible study, or so it's a secondary source that may go deeper on it, but that pastor typically is not going to do that on a regular basis in the pulpit? Am I hearing you correct?
That's what my preliminary research is showing. Now, I have to admit that I only got my data back last week. So this is really preliminary studies. So I'm just looking and analyzing that right now, but that's what it seems like. It seems like they are more comfortable with bringing someone else in.
Right, because they take that other person can absorb the heat or and they can just sort of float about and keep doing what they're doing. Was that surprising to you?
Unfortunately, no. I think that's one of the reasons why we felt as a presbytery that it was important for us to work together and to create this group that could have resources for the congregations in our presbytery, that we wanted to make a difference. And so one of the ways that we could do that was to create our own local resources that could, you know, work in the congregations in our surrounding areas.
Mm-hmm. Douglas, I see your chat. Can you unmute yourself and say what you just wrote here?
Yes, I just noting that there is precedent from the 1960s for the Presbyterian Church providing grants as kind of a form of unemployment insurance for pastors in the South who were speaking out against race. That, I don't know, you know, that's not a sustainable thing for people's employment, but essentially as there were a lot of people who lost their pulpits, and so the church gave them some money just to support them at that time. It's been done before.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Amy, that could be on this second question, which I think is critical. It's just absolutely critical to some form of trying to free up a pulpit to look at remuneration, and it's not just it's not just the money. It's also the benefits. It's also the health insurance. It's also it's all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just raised, Amy, the challenge is that the denomination's relationship to the congregations in most of these white mainline traditions is waning. That there is a pullback, particularly for wealthier, successful congregations and the traditions, to pull away from supporting denominational level initiatives if they're inconsistent with how they view what their mission is. And that's why I'm asking, how does when in this environment, when these denominational structures are suffering at this point in terms of their relationship to the local congregations, I think there's a larger, deeper question that's at stake here about what, and I don't know how to put this in the wording, maybe there's a larger theological question.
Yes.
What?
I think.
Yeah, go on, sorry.
Go ahead. So I think that you're absolutely spot on, that there's a larger theological question. And one of the things that I think I'm going to find is that even in our Reformed tradition, that the white supremacist bent of evangelicalism is infiltrating our churches, and that we're finding churches breaking away from the mainline theology, and they're becoming more popularized by the secular white supremacy, especially in the more rural areas. And I think that that's really concerning. And the fact that pastors don't feel that they can preach the gospel as they see it and interpret it is very concerning to me. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to look at this, and I wanted to hold up the examples from our history who were willing to make huge sacrifices to preach what they felt they were called to preach, what they felt was the gospel, and to encourage my colleagues to pick up this mantle again.
Thanks again.
So, Amy, there's an organization called the Institute for Religion and Democracy. It's IRD. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think that part of their mission is to do exactly what you just said. That is to infiltrate, and they wouldn't use that verb, of course, but to but to really challenge any kind of liberatory, emancipatory theology, and I think infiltrate is the correct verb. And the fact that 55% of white mainliners voted in 2016 and 2020 for Donald Trump confirms that the infiltration is the infiltration is in those is in our churches right now. It's there.
And I didn't put it on the slide, but one of the written in responses from one of the pastors that I sent the survey to simply said that we have too many Trump supporters in my congregation. I can't talk about this issue.
Amy, you have a question in the chat from Deborah Mumford. Deborah's question is, you had a book, White Fragility, in one of your slides. Have you engaged in discussions around this book? If so, how have those discussions been attended and received?
Yes, I have actually hosted, not only in my own congregation, but I've been invited to host Zoom, I guess, book clubs with other Presbyterian churches. They have gone surprisingly well. They have been very challenging for people. However, I think that when we listen attentively and help people unpack their emotions and allow them to share stories and get through their first frustrations and reactions, their reactionary part, those groups really built and grew. And from those particular groups, we did another one on the book Cast. And this particular Lent, I have invited a number of people from our Presbytery to join me in this devotional. So I wouldn't say that we have a humongous group of white people who are feeling called, but we have a strong group of people in our Presbytery who are feeling called to learn and to teach others and to really embrace liberation as a part of our Christian identity.
And Amy, you have another question from Erica. Erica asks, what areas do you mean when you say rural areas? Are you saying rural areas are less progressive?
So that's a really great question. My experience has been that areas, for example, with colleges, areas around institutions, like college towns and things like that, tend to be more liberal and more progressive. And in that has played out in our particular presbytery. That may not be the case everywhere. I can only speak to this particular region and what I'm seeing here. But what I am seeing here is that there are particular regions that are definitely more aligned with Trump, and those also tend to be the more resistant theologically.
Amy, you've got from Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller, can you unmute yourself and just say just a word, 30 seconds on St. Luke's? Then we're going to take a 10-minute break and we're going to invite Reverend Brian Harrington to come up. But can you speak to St. Luke's, please?
Hi, Amy. I was with St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Indianapolis for 17 years. I would say it's Trump territory. When I went there, it was over 6,000. I'd say we're probably between 4 and 5 there now. But they have taken on racism head on, which is huge for them, to lose members, to lose funding, you name it. But they do have a separate website on this, so you may want to Google them. And if in fact you need some contact information to connect to some of the associate pastors there who's actually running it, I'll be more than happy to get you connected.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. That's excellent work, Amy. Excellent first renderings of your research. You're just now getting some data results and already making some significant findings. I hope it's fulfilling for you, this research as a pastor and a disciple of Jesus who is trying to be faithful to the gospel in an area that it really is a kind of legion of demons.